very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. So before I start, I want to be respectful of everybody's time because we have gotten a little bit of a late start. It's now almost 8 o'clock. So how long should I speak, Chris? Okay, so I'm going to talk for 30 minutes. I don't have to zip out of here instantly, but I do have to catch planes, so I can't stay forever. But anyway, thank you. Thank you very much. It's funny what Chris said about people in academic life not being willing to speak about marriage and the family. In my new book, The Sexual State, which I'm going to refer to, in the acknowledgments, the last person I thank is my husband. I would like to thank my husband, Rob Morse. He made it possible for me to leave academic life. And this allowed me both full-time motherhood and independent thought, and I could not have written this book without both of those gifts. Thank you, honey. Right, so leaving academic life is significant. So why the flourishing family, why the economy needs the family, and this is the issue that first got me into the issues relating to the family. As Chris said, I didn't really mean to get involved in gay marriage. I don't know anybody who wants to get involved in gay marriage, actually. It's kind of a bummer of a topic to be involved in. People yell at you and are mean to you and stuff. So I'm a hate group, just so you know. Okay, just so you know what manner of person you're dealing with. If I pull out a white hood at some point or whatever, okay, you were warned. So this talk is going to go by pretty fast, and I'm not going to be able to cover everything now because we are getting a little bit of a late start. But if you will give me your email address, I will send you a PDF of these slides, and that way you'll have all of the references and everything like that that I talk about. So we'll get this going around. And also, I can probably send you the slides from the presentation last night at the University of Dallas, which only a few of you were at. So that'll be good. All right, so the sexual revolution is what we're really here to talk about. And the sexual revolution is in the news every day. Every day, there's something new and crazy, and each thing crazier than the next, right? And so these images that you see up there, you'll recognize as people who in some way or another have run afoul of either solid rules about sexual life or people who have had their character impugned. I just switched out that top image and put Brett Kavanaugh in there. I put that in just yesterday before there was something else in there that was slightly crazy, okay? So that's why it's important to stay informed on this issue. If you want to stay informed, you got to be on it every day. And that's why I'm inviting you to sign up for the Ruth newsletter, follow us on Facebook, check out my blog periodically, because I literally am on it every day. And if you want to know what are we supposed to think, what are we supposed to do here, and you don't have time to think it through yourself, that's what we're here to do. So the book, my recent book, this is a copy of it, The Sexual State, How Elite Ideologies Are Destroying Lives, and Why the Church Was Right All Along. Okay, that's kind of an unfortunate subtitle at the moment, given the things that are going on in the Catholic Church. But what I mean to say is not that every person in the Catholic Church is right, but that the Church's teaching is correct about marriage and family and human sexuality. And I do always like to point out that the positions that are now considered distinctively Catholic at one time were the common heritage of all Christian faith traditions, taught pretty much the same thing right up until about 5 minutes ago in historical time. So I want to give you just an overview of the topic of the economy, to try to tie in the family with the economy, just give you a little bird's eye view of life in Lake Charles. Now, Lake Charles is a 100,000 population, basically, but it's a very fast-growing economy. We've got oil extraction people, and we've got oil-using people. So we've got all the plastic plants and the oil processing and all that. So whether the price is high or the price is low, Lake Charles is fine, right? So it's a very fast-growing economy. It's a very religious community. People take Catholicism very seriously. Being a Catholic is part of the Cajun identity. As an oppressed people, they still think of themselves very much as Catholic. And even there, even in a fast-growing economy with religious people, family breakdown is everywhere. It is everywhere. To the point that it's difficult for some of these plants to get workers. It's difficult for tradesmen to keep good guys on the job. All they need is somebody who shows up every day sober. And it's hard to fill those jobs. Why is that? Now, my son, it turns out, I have an adopted son who's 30 years old. I'll tell you a little bit about him in a minute. But he lives near us in Lake Charles, and he has had his own experience with substance abuse and so on, and so he participates in Narcotics Anonymous and all of that. So he knows that community of people. And he says to me, Mom, I'm so grateful that you and Dad are here and you help me. Because the people that he sees at his meetings, they don't have anybody. They have nobody. If their car breaks down, if they need to borrow 20 bucks, they have no one to bail them out. Because why? At the lower socioeconomic levels in society, where family breakdown is rampant, what that means as a practical matter is it means that your parents are preoccupied with their next boyfriend or girlfriend, or they're preoccupied with their drug experience or whatever it is. And so technically you're an adult, but if, in fact, everybody needs a little help from their parents, right? All along you need that, but nobody's there. Nobody is there for each other. And so it shows up in the economy with all these unfilled jobs. Great jobs that are going begging because there just aren't enough people to do them. So that's the first thought that I want you to have that image in your mind of how much we take for granted that the family is doing for people that is no longer being done on a routine basis for lots of people in our culture. That's simply not getting done. Okay, so this is the outline I plan to cover. I don't think I'm going to get to everything on this presentation, but I want to talk first of all, the two main things. I think I'll probably skip over number 2 and not spend quite so much time on that. But Love and Economics want to talk about why the economy needs the family, and then we'll talk about how the state generates family breakdown, and then just a few words about what we can do about it, what each of us can, how we can help to participate in doing something constructive. So why does the economy need the family? Well, if you think about it, a free society needs people who can control themselves, who can govern themselves. When we walk out of this room today, very few of us are going to go and look in the drugstore and see if we can get away with pickpocketing or get away with shoplifting. Most people don't do that. And if you have too many people who do that, you've got a mess, okay? So we need people who have a conscience and people who can control themselves. And the real issue is, where does the conscience come from? And this is the first issue that got me involved in the study of the family. As Chris mentioned, we have an interesting family story. After 4 years of infertility and a whole lot of spiritual warfare that I won't tell you about, my husband and I adopted a little boy from Romania. This is the boy I just mentioned, who's now 30 years old and doing fine. Okay, but when he came at the age of 2 1/2, he had been profoundly neglected. And 6 months after he arrived, we gave birth to a baby girl. So how's that for a Catholic thing, right? You have 2 kids within 6 months. Actually, there's this 54-day novena that you may have heard about. Okay, have you ever heard of the 54-day novena? It's a very powerful novena. I prayed that to have babies, and I ended up with 2 kids in 6 months. So I'm just saying that novena works, okay, in case you want to know. But anyway, so we had a baby in the normal way, and then we have a child come to us after 2 years of profound neglect. So what does that tell us? It tells us kids need their parents. Kids really need their parents. And we take for granted all the things that mothers and fathers do for their children. Well, the key thing, one key thing that I noticed as a social science person is that we need people with a conscience. And your conscience develops by trusting your mother and your father. See, when mom and dad want you to behave, you know, when you're little, when you're like 2 or something, you can pick them up and get them out of trouble, right? But, or you can tell them, well, I don't want you to do that. Well, they don't do it right away, right? You have to work on that a little bit. 2-year-olds, have you ever noticed 2-year-olds do not respect property rights? Have you ever noticed that? Okay, so in economics, we're all about property rights and stuff, right? Well, okay, that's not gonna fly. How does that happen? Well, they trust you, they care about you, they want you to be happy with you, so when you tell them don't do that, they try to please mommy, they try to please daddy. Eventually, you just kind of give them the stink eye from across the room, and that keeps them in line, right? You don't have to get over there and pick them up and get them out of trouble, because dad will kill me, you know, if I do X, Y, or Z. So that whole process of trust and bonding and attachment, that whole process develops the groundwork for the conscience, because the person now has that internal compass. They can go out and use their freedom without bothering other people too much. And that's really what we are hoping for, right? The people, we can be free and not trouble each other. So the conscience, and this is the theme of Love and Economics. I noticed that John Paul said this in one of his very first encyclicals. He said, the human person is meant for love, okay? And the attachment disordered orphan does not encounter love, right? And so therefore this quote, although John Paul wasn't thinking of those babies, I don't think, this quote applies exactly to that situation. John Paul said, man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible for himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not encounter love, if he does not experience it and make it his own. Those babies don't have life figured out whatsoever when they're left in a crib by themselves. And that's why we need moms and dads. So I sometimes go into this a little bit more detail, and in my book, Love and Economics, I do go into this in more detail. It's not good for man to be alone. Yeah, that's true. Actually, it's not even possible for man to be alone. And it certainly isn't possible for the baby to be alone. A left alone baby is going to die, right? So, what we've done in our culture is, in our generation, Chris and I were talking about this, we all had the idea that we were going to be more free because we don't have to follow all those sexual rules. We're going to be free. It's going to be fun. But we didn't think about the fact that the next generation is going to be less free because you've got kids who aren't attached to people, and therefore you have to swoop in and control them. Somebody has to come in from outside to manage their behavior, which they can't manage themselves. So yeah, baby boom generation is more free, but subsequent generations are less free. So that's the theme of Love and Economics, which I didn't bring with me today. You can still buy that online though. Okay, so I'm going to skip over marriage and equality and just how troubling family breakdown really is, except to give you this theme from the Ruth Institute, which is at the Ruth Institute, our dream is that every child be welcomed into a loving home with their own married mother and father. And the reason we want that is so that every child can have a relationship with their own parents in the absence of some unavoidable tragedy, like what happened to my son, or like when people die and stuff, so that every child can have a relationship with their own parents, and so that every person, without exception, can know their identity, can know who they are, can know the identity of their mother and father. No more falsified birth certificates, okay? And so when these rights are violated, we call this a structural injustice to the child. And the competing worldviews, the worldview of the Ruth Institute, and I presume of the APPI, is that every child has rights. Every child has identity rights and relational rights with respect to their parents. And therefore, here's the part we don't like to say too loudly, so that's why I put it in small type. Therefore, these rights of children impose obligations on adults. We don't like to admit that we have obligations, right? But these are the obligations that every decent society imposes on adults for the sake of their children. The alternative competing worldview is that every adult has the right to the sexual activity they want with a minimum of inconvenience, and kids just have to accept whatever the adults choose to give them. After all, kids are resilient. That is the #1 anthem of the sexual revolution. We get to do whatever we want because we're so fragile, and our egos and our psyches are so frail. We get to partner and repartner and leave the kids and come back to the kids and bring them new parents and new boyfriends and new sisters and new siblings, and then the siblings disappear and they're supposed to be okay with it. But they're fine because they're resilient, and we get to do whatever we want. Okay, we don't say that too loudly, that last part about the kids having to just suck it up, because we'd be ashamed of ourselves if we just blurted it out like that. But that's approximately the position that we're dealing with. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the alternative family forms from the child's perspective. The lecture last night did that, so if you want to listen in, that will be online in a little while. So the effects of divorce on children are very well documented by now, and this is one of the documents that we talk about. So how many people have been victimized by various parts of the sexual revolution? The divorce ideology. There have been about 1 million children per year experience the divorce of their parents every year since 1972. That adds up to a lot of adult children of divorce with nobody even noticing that this is a thing, right? All right, marriage inequality. All right, so let's talk about the sexual state in a little more detail here. I define the sexual revolution as having 3 parts. The first thing is that a good and decent society should do everything possible to separate sex from babies. I call that the contraceptive ideology. We should do everything possible to separate sex from babies. Do you recognize that as being current in our society? Okay. Second point, a good society should separate sex and babies from marriage, which I've kind of alluded to, right? And I call that the divorce ideology. So under this heading of the divorce ideology, I include any kind of family structure that separates children from one of their parents. So that would include sperm donation and single parenthood by choice and all those types of things, as well as divorce proper. And then finally, a good and decent society should do everything possible to wipe out all differences between men and women, because after all, that's all socially constructed, except for those differences that you specially want for yourself, because after all, the body isn't really very important, and if you think you're a woman or you think you're a man, it's all good. And I call that the gender ideology. Now, those 3 things, each one of those things, I have a full 45-minute presentation on each one, so if you want more detail about it, you can get it. And of course, it's in the book too, if you're interested in it. So the thing that I want to point out to you about the sexual revolution is the way in which the state has used the sexual revolution to empower itself. And one of the ways that it has done that is that when families break down and problems occur, what is the go-to solution to that problem? The go-to solution is a government program, right? So if kids don't have very much money because their parents aren't living together, or their parents aren't married, or they were never married, by golly, we've got programs to help that situation, okay? So the state is spending more and more resources on managing the problems associated with family breakdown. So this is one point. The second point is that if you look back on my little chart here, these 3 things, all 3 of these points are false. Okay, I probably have a full slide on this, but since we don't have time, I'm just going to say it. Take a look here. Sex actually makes babies, y'all. Right? Right? Are we all on board with that? Are we all grown-ups here? Okay, so yes, you can do things to reduce the probability of a particular act resulting in a pregnancy. Yes, you can do that. But build a whole society around the idea that sex is a sterile activity? No, you cannot do that. Okay, so this is irrational. I call it a fantasy ideology, right? They have an image of how they want life to be. They have an image of what they want the world to look like. And this makes people feel so good that they can have sex without babies or without any responsibility. I call it actually the superstition of contraception. What is a superstition? It's something you believe in spite of the evidence because you like the way it makes you feel. All right? So this is superstition to believe that this is possible. The divorce ideology is also false because children actually do need their parents, which even a small amount of observation would tell you that this is true, right? And men and women actually are different. So what that means is that the state has become captured by people who have this fantasy ideology that simply cannot be. It cannot be done. And so therefore, the state is now empowered to use all the power and propaganda that is required to bring about something that cannot be brought about. In this respect, it is similar to communism, it is similar to fascism. It's not a thing of the right and left. To me, it's beyond right and left, right? It's the people involved in the fantasy ideology versus pretty much the people of transcendent faith. Those of us who have a transcendent faith know that we don't get to just remake the universe in our own image, right? And so people left and right love this whole fantasy ideology of the sexual revolution. So just like the communists thought, by golly, we can have a prosperous society without any property rights. That was their fantasy. And they could not make that happen. And we've got Venezuela going on to prove it once again if we ever needed any further proof, right? But they love this idea, and so they go for it. Likewise, we've got people who love the idea of sex without responsibility, and they go for it, and it takes a lot of power to try to make that happen, and it takes a lot of propaganda to talk people into believing it's possible and good and wiping out all the countervailing evidence that continues to emerge. So let me say just a few words about the fiscal implications, because I suspect that all of you have fiscal conservative friends who don't want to hear anything about the family, but who might listen to an argument about fiscal things, okay? So there are enormous fiscal consequences of family breakdown because the taxpayers are paying the costs associated with making up for what happens to the family. About 10 years ago, somebody studied this in the United States and concluded that the taxpayers' cost to the decline in marriage amounted to about $112 billion per year, and that's the taxpayer cost. That says nothing of the cost to the family, right? And what happens to them when they've got a kid who's gone completely off the rails, right? That was at that time the equivalent of the GDP of New Zealand. So this is not chump change that we're talking about here. This is a lot of money. And just to give one other statistic, that's it's not on the slide, but something that I looked up one time. If you think about what it takes to manage a child who can't manage themselves, you got a kid in our case, the California Youth Authority. That would be the juvenile justice system arm of California. At the time I looked this up, it cost the state of California about $48,000 for 1 year for one kid in the California Youth Authority. At that same time, the taxpayers were spending about $16,000 per year to send a kid to Berkeley. So now think about that. At the end of 1 year in the California Youth Authority, you've spent like 3 years worth of student at Berkeley, and what do you have after a year of a kid at the California Youth Authority? If you're lucky, you broke even and you got the kid to no longer be a social problem, right? But all of those resources that could have been spent on putting a kid through Berkeley, and by the way, not all kids at Berkeley are crazy. Some of them go into biochemical, they go to med school and stuff like that. You just see on the news the ones that are out there. My daughter went to Berkeley. She was head of the pro-life club at Berkeley. The nut doesn't fall far from the tree. Okay, anyway, so taxpayer cost of family breakdown, this is something that you can share with your friends. This is very expensive. And another way in which family breakdown empowers the state is through the mechanism of no-fault divorce, and specifically the fact that what no-fault divorce frequently means is unilateral, unwanted divorce. Now, very few people talk about this. Now, as I described this, we created this term at the Ruth Institute. We call it the reluctantly divorced person. And what we mean by reluctantly divorced is a person who would like to stay married, who wanted to be married, but because their spouse wanted a divorce, they are divorced. And the state always takes sides with the person who wants the marriage the least. That is what no-fault divorce means. And you need to show that, explain that to your libertarian buddies, okay? So for a long time, I had no idea. And as I'm looking out here, I see that a lot of you know somebody who's had this happen to them. Most people know somebody who's had this happen to them. It turns out that we discovered, this is a question that has not been studied, what percentage of divorces have an unwilling partner, okay? This hasn't been studied. So my buddy Mark Regnerus stumbled over this 70% number that I have up there. In the course of studying something else, he figured out that about 70% of divorces have a reluctant partner. Okay, now, first of all, that's unjust. It's a mess. It's a hot mess, right? If you know any of these situations, you know that that's true. But the thing I want to call your attention to from the perspective of freedom is that when you've got a reluctant party, the state must intervene to remove that reluctant party from the assets of the family, which typically mean the family home and contact with the children, okay? That's what a reluctant divorce actually looked like. We have this fantasy ideology of no-fault divorce, that it's mutual. two sensible, mature, grown-up people decide to call it quits. And it's just so much easier if we don't go through all this fault-finding procedure with evidence and all of that humiliating stuff. So we'll make it cheaper for them to end their marriage, not realizing that that scenario doesn't apply to most of the cases, right? You've got a reluctant party and you have to separate those two people. So what happens is the family courts become involved literally in the minutia of family life, right? Telling people how much money they have to spend on their kids, examining people's finances. This court system that can't figure out whether somebody committed adultery or not is now poring over everybody's tax returns and managing people's child care plans and writing into divorce decrees the exact date and time that you have to turn your child over to the other parent on Christmas Eve, right? That's part of the family court. This is a major intrusion into the private sector that has been made possible by this one little corner of the sexual state and the sexual revolution. Gender ideology and feminism, oh boy, I'm not going to go too far with this because we don't have time, but old school feminism basically taught, when I was young, men and women are identical except women are better. That was feminism. And so therefore the state has to wipe out all differences between men and women. Well, now we've gotten to the point where we say that if a person thinks they are of the opposite sex, they can change it. And the state's role now is to enforce that person's new legal identity and make sure everybody goes along with saying who they really are. Now, I'm going to go through this because we just have too much stuff. But I do want to pause on Bruce Jenner. I want you to look at this image of Bruce Jenner, who thinks he's a woman. This is a highly stereotypical image of femininity. I myself have been a woman my entire life, except for when I was a little girl. I've been a woman my whole life. I have never dressed like that. Most women I know do not dress like that. Last night at the University of Dallas, I said that, and all these girls roared with laughter, right? I mean, we don't dress like that. This is some man's view of what it means to be a woman. It's no wonder the radical lesbian feminists despise transgenderism. I don't know if you know that, but the LGBT coalition is falling apart. The T's and the L's are at war with each other at the moment. It's one of the cute things that you'd know if you follow the Ruth Institute, because we talk about this kind of stuff. It's kind of unraveling, you know, the thing's unraveling. But the thing I want to point out to you about the whole Bruce Jenner issue and transgenderism that has to do with freedom and the economy is this. If the government can make you say Bruce Jenner is a woman, they can make you say anything. And that is ultimately the point of transgender philosophy. It is about power. So I have some funny things here. Okay, so I said this already. The sexual revolution's irrational, it's impossible, it cannot stand on its own. If you build society around the idea that sex makes babies, you can easily get people to believe that because you have evidence confirming this belief on a regular basis that sex and babies are somehow connected. If you want to build a society around the idea that sex does not make babies, you got a lot of explaining to do, right? And so the state empowers itself and, in a sense, its agents, the administrative state, the deep state, however you want to think about this. A lot of people are noticing the way in which the state is not, there's kind of a fluid boundary in the ruling class that includes different parts of the managerial class and different parts of elite entertainment and academia and those things. We're kind of all working hand in glove on this issue to create the fantasy ideology. And those ideologies have captured the state. I simply want to leave you with this thought that this is a totalitarian ideology that no Christian should have anything to do with. We have been tap dancing around it and playing footsie with it for way too long. Okay. So people often want to know what are the motives of some of the elites? Why are they doing this? Why do they care about it? There are a lot of people who are making money off of various aspects of the sexual revolution. And the people at the top of society have enough money to buy their way out of the problems that they get into or the problems that they cause. Whereas a poorer person, like I described at the beginning, are working class blue collar guys in Lake Charles, family breakdown's a disaster for them. it's not like Angelina and Brad getting a, having a new press release over their latest breakup or whatever it is, And something has happened. I wonder what that, did I do something bad? Okay. Well, and let's not underestimate the power of the desire to just have sex without constraints, and that people think they can get away with it and want to get away with it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to close by doing a short reading out of here, but because I know we're running out of time, but I want to just point out there are flyers for the book on the table. There's an order card that you can order the book. I'm selling it for $25 today, and I want to sell these too. I don't want to take them on the plane. But if you want to order it, I'll honor that $25 price. Okay. But I want to just close with the reading of one little part of the sexual state. Most Americans of faith thought that separation of church and state means that the state has to leave the faithful people alone. We come to find out that it really means the church must leave the state alone. The state permits us to have control over unimportant things like Christian burial and who gets to receive communion, but the state gets to control important things. And to add insult to injury, the state gets to decide what counts as important and what is not. What then is the purpose of the sexual state? Perhaps you supposed that the purpose of government was to protect people from force or fraud, or to ensure domestic tranquility, or to provide for the common defense or promote the general welfare. That's so 5 minutes ago. The real purpose of government today is to give people the sex lives they want at a minimum of inconvenience. You want to have sex without a baby? No problem. We'll give you contraception at no cost to you. You want to have sex, you got pregnant, you don't want the baby? That's inconvenient. We'll allow you to have an abortion and even help you pay for it. You want to have sex with a person of your own sex and you want to have a baby? That's really inconvenient, but we'll help you. We'll restructure the legal system and subsidize the technology that will make it possible for you to have all the babies you want without the inconvenience of having to deal with the child's other parent. Harsh? Maybe. Inaccurate? I don't think so. It's time we face the reality of the government in which we now live. We live in the sexual state. Thank you very much. Okay, so I can take a few questions until Megan says I have to leave to get to the airport in time. But I want to respect people's time. If you have to leave for an obligation or something, I think that would be okay. But I'm happy to take questions. Did everyone get to sign the newsletter list who wanted to get to sign the newsletter list? Did it make it all the way around the room? Did you guys get it? Did you guys get it here in the front? Okay. All right, very well. Questions? And I'll send you the whole PowerPoint, and there'll be stuff on here I didn't explain, but you'll probably figure it out from the PowerPoint. So, yes, Elena. I was going to do that. Oh, look at that. Thank you. I'll slip you a 20 afterwards. You guys, all of our values are at stake from the sexual revolution. Everything's at stake. So a lot of, I know Christian businessmen and Christian businesswomen don't want to get involved in these questions because it's icky and people yell at you and stuff like that. But the fact is, all of our values are at stake with the sexual revolution. Fiscal responsibility, freedom, limited government, our religious values, our own families, right? That's obviously important to us. And now we have all this crazy stuff going on with sexual abuse, newly revealed sexual abuse. So what I want to encourage, let me see, this is the acronym that I've developed, and it will take a little while to explain it all, but briefly, what I'm proposing is that we as ordinary people who have some vocational responsibilities for some areas of these things, of course, whatever vocational responsibility you have, use it, go for it. But just in general, we need to do these 4 items. Number 1, support people who have been harmed by the sexual revolution. And that includes the invisible people like the adult children of divorce and reluctantly divorced people. And it includes victims of sexual abuse. Because, one of the really sad things that has been happening is we found out people would try to tell, kids would try to tell their parents and nobody listened to them. right? So we need to support the people who have suffered. H stands for holiness. We need to pursue our own personal holiness, and that's not just because we need to pray and fast because everybody's supposed to pray and fast, we're supposed to be holy. It's also the case that if we're holding on to some personal sexual sin, that is going to compromise our ability to witness, okay? And I saw this all the time with Prop 8. I would say kids need their parents, and somebody would come back to me and say, why are you picking on gay people? More people lose their parents to divorce than to gay marriage, so shut up. And I learned over time, that's why I developed this material actually, you know, that we need to deal with whatever we may be holding on to, whatever issues we may have, we need to release those, repent of them, and that's part of the holiness process. I think I have a slide in here of the ladies in the pink pussy hats. Do you know what I'm talking about? Some of you are shaking your head, some of you are nodding, some of you are yeah, okay. The ladies in the pink pussy hats are never going to solve the problem of sexual harassment of women. And everybody here, I think, can see that. It's like immediately obvious to us. But to drill down as to what the problem is, they're holding on to the sexual revolution, which includes the very ideas that are the problem driving sexual harassment. They want to hold on to their idea that everybody gets to have sex whenever they want to. They're hanging on to their pills, their pornography, and their sexual privilege, right? And wearing pink pussy hats, and that's going to solve it all. Okay, so that's why your personal holiness is important. O is organized. We need to get organized. A lot of bad people are very well organized. It's okay for good people to be organized also. And so I would recommend that if you're part of a prayer group or a study group, a Bible group, anything like that, that you add to that a few minutes where you report to each other what is going on in our community that we need to be organized to do something about. For instance, right now, it's the drag queen story hour going on in local libraries. Are you all aware of that? Oh, good. I'm glad you don't know about it. It's gross. But anyway, some people are, this is happening in Lafayette, Louisiana. You know, they're bringing in drag queens to read stories to preschoolers. And the local people are like, no. You know, they're getting organized to deal with it. So you must get organized. Add to your existing groups a component where you're checking this out. And then finally, you need to educate yourselves, which is when you're at these meetings, read something together and discuss it so that you're all getting better informed about the issues and how to respond to them. So that's my story about what you could do. And the Ruth Institute has plenty of material for you to read and educate yourself with. In fact, you could use our newsletter every week, and that would get you started. But we have got to be organized. We have just got to be organized.
I have a question.
Yes?
You put up the Kavanaugh case, so I'm curious, how does the sexual state inform and nurture what's going on with the Kavanaugh nomination?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Okay, did everybody hear the question? Okay, so the first thing is the reason Supreme Court nominations are so contested is because of the sexual state. Okay, in other words, what's at stake is the continued ability of the state to prohibit all regulation of abortion. All right, controlling the Supreme Court is a very important component of controlling and continuing the progress of the sexual state. That's why everybody's hysterical about it. So that's point one, right? And that, you know, no way that would be consistent with the founding principles, right? So that's point one. Second point is the issues of allegations and counter-allegations. That is a part of the sexual ideology also, and here's how it works. It's a little bit more subtle than some of the other things that we've talked about. What the sexual state promises is freedom. You get to do whatever you want. Right up until the point where you cross some boundary, and then all hell breaks loose, and all the powers of the state and its arms, its auxiliaries, swoop in and attack the person who has allegedly crossed the boundaries. So you ask yourself, so let's look at this case with the allegation against Kavanaugh. Let's say something happened. Back in the day, you would not allow a bunch of 15-year-olds to be unsupervised having alcohol. That already would have been a violation. They never would have gotten that far. You know, the environment where such a thing could have taken place, that environment wouldn't have been there. So you have very obvious boundary violations well before you get to the point where somebody's groping you trying to take your clothes off. And then that was the purpose of it. So now we're more free. The kids can do what they want. But now we've got this thing that has happened that nobody really knows what it was. Nobody really knows if it was bad. Nobody has evidence about it one way or another. But we have this allegation, and it's oh so terrible because it's a violation of women's dignity and boundaries and so on. And how do we deal with it now? The way we deal with it now is somebody has the power and the authority to adjudicate a situation that is intrinsically, inherently ambiguous. So who's empowered in this whole thing? The girl's not really empowered because she's vulnerable in a way she never was before. The boy's not empowered because his life could be over basically from one false allegation. Who's empowered? The people who have the ability and the authority and the power to make completely arbitrary decisions. That's who's empowered by it. In this case, it's the press. Basically, it's the press. In the case of college date rape tribunals, they have some other fancy name, I don't know what it is. I imagine you don't even have that at University of Dallas. But in a lot of schools, it's a thing that they have tribunals and procedures for adjudicating situations that come up. And a lot of times, a single allegation can tank somebody and they get thrown out of school. And then they have that mark against them. So who's empowered in that environment? The people, the administrators who are making those arbitrary decisions. That's what I would argue is in a sense the point, right? If the point of the whole thing is power, that's a lot of power. See, that's not a problem. We look at it and say, this is a problem. Well, it depends on what you're trying to do, whether that's a problem or not, you see? If what you're trying to do is increase your power and authority and your ability to, kind of be noodling into all kinds of details of people's lives and controlling them, not so bad. So that's the two-part way I would explain how that goes. Yes, Megan. Sorry?
I'm wondering about the connection between family and economy. And I understand your arguments, but if we look at some of the most thriving economies, they tend to be attached to states that have a breakdown in family. So how would you respond to somebody that says, actually, the economy does better when you have like a situation of...
So what would be an example? What are you thinking of?
China, for example, where family life is controlled or limited, or the more developed are the same countries that are at the forefront of promoting the sexual state?
Well, it's certainly true that China has the sexual state on steroids in the sense that they're trying to control people's fertility, which is, when you think about it, completely outrageous what they're doing. What they don't have is I don't know that they have, is family breakdown really their problem? Families don't form. Yeah, I don't quite know how to.
Well, I'm also thinking of like
The Scandinavian countries are not what they appear to be. And the one thing that I would point out about the Scandinavian countries is that, first of all, there's evidence of some unraveling of some of those places, but also they look like they're doing well because, in effect, you've got women going to work taking care of other people's children, right? So you put your kids in daycare and the job you have is to take care of other people's children. So part of what looks like a growth in the economy is really monetizing something that could have been done in the private sector. But the ways in which the Scandinavian situation is unraveling, part of it has to do with migration because they haven't produced enough new babies, so they have more migration. Now they've got problems. Instead of having a very homogeneous society where some of those things might be expected to work, now they have some civilizations with very different kinds of values, and they don't really have the, what do you want to call it, the resources, the sort of social cultural resources to actually deal with that. So Scandinavia, I think, is no longer the dream come true for the welfare state and the sexual state. And also, you know, people are really unhappy in a lot of ways. I mean, there was a study a few years ago that was looking at the impact of single parents on the mental health of children, and it was in Sweden. And what it showed was, I want to say this was like 2003, so it's been about 15 years. But what it showed was that children of single parents were at greater risk, like double the risk, for things like suicide and anxiety and depression. And this is taking account of prior mental health history of the parents. So even with the most generous welfare state in the world, there's still problems. But we just don't look at the problems, right? Because that doesn't fit the storyline, doesn't fit the narrative, so we don't include that in our discussion. I think there was one, yes?
One question. It's a serious question, but it's probably not going to sound too serious, but I have 4 daughters and a wonderful daughter-in-law. All of them are psychologists or counselors that deal with the ramifications of this breakdown.
Yes.
Highlighted here. I mean, battered children, just really the dark side of the totem pole here. But they ask me one question always, because I grew up in college and high school in the 60s. When did all this start to happen? And I trace it to 2 events. And I'm kind of serious about this too, in the sense that I think it's the advent of the pharmaceutical companies introduced birth control pills in 60, 61, 62 time frame. And then the women removed the bras. It's kind of coincidental, it all started. What's your thought on when this massive breakdown really succeeded on right there?
Well, yeah, the women taking off their bras was certainly a socially significant thing. The women's liberation movement, and that was really the kickoff of the whole gender ideology. And so in that same period of time, yeah, I would not argue against what you just said. What I would add to the issue about the pill is that not just the pharmaceutical companies, but also a whole ideological structure was put into place to promote the use of contraception. And I talk about, that's actually the longest section in this book, is the section on the contraceptive ideology. And one of the things I found in looking at it is that there had been, you know, people have known since time immemorial how to limit their pregnancies, right? I mean, people, somehow, they figured it out. And what you see among the people who are actively promoting the overturning of the laws that regulated the use of contraception, in Connecticut, I analyzed Griswold versus Connecticut, that Supreme Court case. I analyzed the lead up to that quite a bit. And one of the things you see is that the people who wanted this, what they wanted to be able to do was for government to promote contraception. It was never enough for them that it was legally available. That was never good enough, because it had been legally available, you know, in various ways for a long time. They wanted to be able to actively promote it, which they couldn't do if it was illegal, right? And so if you ask yourself the question, well, how long was it? You know, how long did it take between the time that there were no restrictions on it and the time that the government started putting its big fat thumb on the scale of people's decision-making processes and promoting it and subsidizing various ways? How long did that take? The answer is about 5 minutes. You know, I mean, because it was already in place in overseas programs. Before 1965, the federal government was already promoting contraception abroad as part of its foreign policy, right? They were worried about too many poor people, you know, and so that combination of things, it's like a perfect storm of the population control people, the feminists, and the environmentalists, all saying we got too many people and we got to do something about controlling fertility. My personal belief is that the significance of the feminist thing and the population control thing at the same time, the feminists provided cover for the population control people. Population controllers are not, by and large, left-wingers, okay? And this is like Henry Kissinger, you know, kind of thing. This is not a left-wing kind of thing. They were like, you know, John D. Rockefeller III. I mean, these are establishment-type people thinking we need to control the population. Well, most people don't like that idea. So what feminism did was to provide them with a way of promoting that objective without it looking like they were promoting that objective, because really, we're really here to empower women. That's what we're here for, is to empower women so that they can go to college. That's what it's really all about. And so I think that union was very significant.
Kind of following.
Yes, please.
With your economic background, what do you think the economic scene would look like in this country today if those 60 million abortions did not occur?
Well, Social Security would be functioning. You know, I mean, you wouldn't have this massive unfunded debt that we have. So that would be one aspect of it. I think that we have the resources to sustain more people. I mean, the idea that we're going to run out of stuff, you know, that always was a myth. I think that we would have a more thriving economy than we do, and it would be more stable long term. Right now, demographic winter is a real thing, and people are not facing it. Are you all familiar with that term of demographic winter? It has to do with population decline rather than population explosion. Anybody who knows anything is no longer worried about population explosion. If somebody talks like that, you know that they don't know what they're talking about, right? So we just wouldn't be dealing with that. We wouldn't be having that. And we would have people growing up in an appropriate frame of time, right? That you don't wait till you're 35 to take on adult responsibilities, you know, and that would be huge in a lot of ways. So thank you for that question.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you. Don't make me take these books. Don't make me take these books on plane, y'all. Okay.
Jen will stick around for a few minutes.